How are you? Are you afraid of skeletons? It's nothing to be ashamed of. A lot of people are. Although there's no technical term coined for this, the majority of analysts have called it osteophobia, a term originated from the Greek word osteon, meaning bones in English. This occurs when one develops a fear of bones. Scott Sanders' story, The Anatomy Lesson, will either cure you of this irrational fear or drive you out of your mind. Pay attention. Class is in session. The Anatomy Lesson, written by Scott Sanders, narrated by Edward E.French. By the time I reached the anatomy library, all the bones had been checked out. Students bent over the wooden boxes everywhere, in hallways and snack bar, assembling feet and arms, scribbling diagrams in notebooks. Half the chairs were occupied by slouching skeletons, and reclining skeletons littered the tables like driftwood. Since I also would be examined on the subject the next day, I asked the librarian to search one last time for bone boxes in the storeroom. "But I tell you, they've all been given out," she said, glaring at me from beneath an enormous snarl of dark hair, like a fierce animal caught in a bush. How many students had already pestered her for bones this evening? I persisted. "Medical school rides on this grade. Haven't you got any damaged skeletons? Irregulars?" Ignoring my smile, she measured me with her fierce stare, as if estimating the size of box my bones would fill after she had made supper of me. A shadow drooped beneath each of her eyes, permanent sorrow, like the tear mark of a clown. "Irregulars," she repeated, turning away from the counter. I blinked with relief at her departing back. Only as she slipped noiselessly into the storeroom did I notice her gloved hands. Fastidious, I thought. Doesn't want to soil herself with bone dust and mildew. While awaiting my specimens, I studied the vertebrae which knobbed through the bent necks of students all around me, each one laboring over fragments of skeletons. 5 lumbar vertebrae, 7 cervical, a round dozen thoracic. I rehearsed the names, my confidence building. Presently the librarian returned with a box. It was the size of an orange crate, wooden, dingy from age or dry rot. The metal clasps that held it shut were tarnished a sickly green. No wonder she wore the gloves. "This one's for restricted use," she announced, shoving it over the counter. I hesitated, my hands poised above the crate as if I were testing it for heat. "Well, do you want it or don't you?" she said. Afraid she would return it to the archives, I pounced on it with one hand and with the other signed a borrower's card. Old model?" I inquired pleasantly. She did not smile. I turned away with the box in my arms. The burden seemed lighter than its bulk would have promised, as if the wood had dried with age. Perhaps instead of bones inside, there would be pyramids of dust. The metal clasps felt cold against my fingers. After some searching, I found a clear space on the floor beside a scrawny man whose elbows and knees protruded through rents in his clothing like so many lumps of a sea serpent above the waters. When I tugged at the clasps, they yielded reluctantly. The hinges opened with a gritty shriek, raising for a moment all round me a dozen glazed eyes, which soon returned to their studies. Inside I found the usual wooden trays for bones, light as bird wings, but instead of the customary lining of vinyl, they were covered with a metal the color of copper and the puttyish consistency of lead. Each bone fitted into its pocket of metal. Without consulting notes, I started confidently on the foot, joining tarsal to metatarsal. But it was soon evident that there were too many bones. Each one seemed a bit odd in shape, with an extra flange where none should be, or a socket at right angles to the orthodox position. The only way of accommodating all the bones was to assemble them into a 7-toed monstrosity, slightly larger than the foot of an adult male, phalanges all the same length, with ankle bones bearing the unmistakable nodes for... What? Wings? Flippers? This drove me back to my anatomy text. But no consulting of diagrams would make sense of this foot. A practiced scrape of my knife blade assured me these were real bones. But from what freakish creature? Feeling vaguely guilty, as if in my ignorance I had given birth to this monstrosity, I looked around the library to see if anyone had noticed. Everywhere living skulls bent studiously over dead ones, ignoring me. Only the librarian seemed to be watching me sidelong through her tangled hair. I hastily scattered the foot bones to their various compartments. Next, I worked at the hand, which boasted 6 rather than 7 digits. 2 of them were clearly thumbs, opposite in their orientation, and each of the remaining fingers was double-jointed, so that both sides of these vanished hands would have served as palms. At the wrist, a socket opened in one direction. A ball joint protruded in the other, as if the hand were meant to snap onto an adjoining one. I now bent secretively over my outrageous skeleton, unwilling to meet stares from other students. After tinkering with the fibula and clavicle, each bone recognizable but slightly awry from the human, I gingerly unpacked the plates of the skull. I had been fearing these bones most of all. Their scattered state was unsettling enough to begin with, since in ordinary skeletal kits they would have been assembled into a brain case. Their gathered state was even more unsettling. They would only go together in one arrangement. Yet it appeared so outrageous to me that I forced myself to reassemble the skull 3 times. There was only one jaw, to be sure, though an exceedingly broad one, and only 2 holes for ears. But the skull itself was clearly double, as if 2 heads had been squeezed together like cherries grown double on one stem. Each hemisphere of the brain enjoyed its own cranium. The opening for the nose was in its accustomed place, as were 2 of the eyes. But in the center of the vast forehead, like the drain in an empty expanse of bathtub, was the socket for a 3rd eye. I closed the anatomy text, helpless before this freak. Hunched over to shield it from the gaze of the other students, I stared long at that triangle of eyes, and at the twinned craniums that splayed out behind like a fusion of moons. No, I decided, such a creature was not possible. It was a hoax, a malicious hoax designed to shatter my understanding of anatomy. But I would not fall for the trick. Angrily, I disassembled this counterfeit skull, stuffed the bones back into their metal pockets, clasped the box shut, and returned it to the counter. "This may seem funny to you," I said, "but I have an examination to pass." "Funny?" the librarian replied. "This hoax!" I slapped the box, raising a puff of dust. When she only lifted an eyebrow mockingly, I insisted. "It's a fabrication, an impossibility." "Is it?" she taunted, laying her gloved hands atop the crate. Furious, I said, "It's not even a very good hoax. No one who knows the smallest scrap of anatomy would fall for it." "Really?" she said, peeling the glove away from one wrist. I wanted to shout at her and then hurry away before she could uncover that hand. Yet I was mesmerized by the slide of cloth, the pinkish skin emerging. I found it hard to believe myself. "At first," she said, spreading the naked hand before me, palm up. I was relieved to count only 5 digits. But the fleshy heel was inflamed and swollen, as if the bud of a new thumb were sprouting there. "A scar," I thought feverishly. "Nothing awful." Then she turned the hand over and displayed for me another palm. The fingers curled upward, then curled in the reverse direction, forming a cage of fingers on the counter. I flinched away. Skeletons were shattering in my mind. Names of bones were fluttering away like blown leaves. All my carefully gathered knowledge was scattering. Unable to look at her, unwilling to glimpse the socket of flesh that might be opening on her forehead beneath the dangling hair, I kept my gaze turned aside. "How many of you are there?" I hissed. "I'm the first, so far as I know. Unless you count our friend here," she added, rapping her knuckles against the bone box. I guessed the distances to inhabited planets, conjured up silhouettes of spacecraft. "But where do you come from?" "Boise." Boise, Idaho? "Well, actually, I grew up on a beet farm just outside Boise." "You mean you're I pointed one index finger at her and shoved the other against my chest. Human? Of course. She laughed, a quick sound like the release of bubbles underwater. Students at nearby tables gazed up momentarily from their skeletons with bleary eyes. The librarian lowered her voice until it burbled like whale song. I'm as human as you are, she murmured. But your hands, your face. Until a few months ago, they were just run-of-the-mill human hands. She drew the glove quickly on and touched her swollen cheeks. My face was skinny. My shoes used to fit. Then what happened? I assembled these bones. Again she rapped on the crate. From inside came a hollow clattering, like the sound of gravel sliding. You're becoming one of them? So it appears. Her upturned lips and downturned eyes gave me contradictory messages. The clown-sad eyes seemed too far apart. Even buried under its shrubbery of dark hair, her forehead seemed impossibly broad. Aren't you frightened? I said. Not anymore, she answered. Not since my head began to open. I winced, recalling the vast skull, pale as porcelain, and the triangle of eyes. I touched the bone box gingerly. What is it? I don't know yet. But I begin to get glimmerings, begin to see it, alive and flying. Flying? Swimming, maybe. My vision's still too blurry. For now, I just think of it as a skeleton of the possible. A fossil of the future. I tried to imagine her ankles affixed with wings, her head swollen like a double moon, her third eye glaring. And what sort of creature will you be when you're changed? We'll just have to wait and see. Won't we? We? I echoed, backing carefully over the linoleum. You've put the bones together, haven't you? I stared at my palms, then turned my hands over to examine the twitching skin where knuckles should be. What do you think? Now, wasn't that delightful? You see, there's nothing to be frightened of. Bones, skeletons are the medium through which people live on after death. It's comforting to think that you and I and everyone else will surely die, but our bones will live on without us. Thank you as ever for listening. I'll have another one for you next week. The Anatomy Lesson, narrated by Edward E.French, is copyright 2020. All rights reserved. Direct inquiries regarding this recording to Edward E. French at email edwardfrench06@hotmail.com. Subscribe to the Fiction Fantastique channel, www.youtube.com/FrenchEdward06.